Hi, this is Steve Queen. Welcome to the Livewick Media YouTube channel. I want to share a brief video on John chapter 13, the first 17 or so verses. And this is talking about Jesus right before he washes his disciples' feet. So a passage you may be very familiar with. But Jesus' relationship with the Father was the reason that he was able to serve others the way he did. So let's take a look at it. John chapter 13, starting in verse 1. Now, before the feast of Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come and that he should depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So Jesus knew that his time was short. He was going to depart and go be with the Father. And he had been loving his disciples all along, and he was going to love them to the end, to the very end. And isn't that beautiful and powerful? Jesus was going to continue to love them to the very end. And I know that's how people who love Jesus, that's how we want to live our lives. We don't just want to love Jesus today. We want to love Jesus all the way to the end. And part of that is because if we're listening in our spirits and if we've been taught well from the Word, we have an understanding that Jesus had, which we'll see here in the next few verses, that makes all the difference. Verse 2, the evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, or in his hands, given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. This is the core of this whole message today. Jesus is at supper, and the devil was doing his business, putting it in the heart of one of Jesus' own disciples, Judas Iscariot, to betray Jesus. So Jesus has the most important mission in the entire world that anyone has ever had. And he's got his guys around him, and they're having dinner. And in the midst of this, which should be such a completely beautiful and wonderful and powerful thing, I mean, can you imagine being part of that team in that day? I mean, we are in our day, but being part of that group at that time. And yet in the midst of them is Judas Iscariot, and Jesus knows that. But notice that didn't turn Jesus away. And here's why. Here's how Jesus could love his own to the very end. Here's how Jesus could stay the course, knowing that Judas was right there, sitting right there. And it's in verse 2. Jesus, knowing the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God. These are the big questions that people ask, and they're answered right here. Where did I come from? Why am I here? And where am I going? Jesus knew he had come from God. Jesus knew the Father had given all things into his hands. He knew the mission. He knew what he was here for. And he knew he was going back to God. Because Jesus knew these things, where he came from, what he's here for, and where he was going, he could do what he's about to do. He could serve. He could do the most so-called menial task in the household of that day. He could wash somebody's feet. Jesus himself would wash the feet of his own disciples. You see, because he knew who he was, he could serve. He could do any task, anything that the Father gave him to do, he could and would do, because he knew who he was. Do you know who you are? Do I know? How do we come to know who we are and what we're here for? Relationship with God. In John chapter 15 and John chapter 17, if you haven't read those in a while, it's worth a read on top of what we're looking at now. In John 15, Jesus talks about being the vine and we are the branches, and how intermingled we are and how dependent we are on him. And in John 17, where he prays for us, he talks about him being in us being in him, he and us being in the Father. It's all this intermingling, relationship. It's not just a modern buzzword in church circles. Relationship is what this has always been about. And the kingdom is first about relationship and how the Father wants that relationship with us. Let's get on with the story here in John 13. So in verse 4, Jesus got up from the table, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. So can you imagine these guys? Jesus is coming and washing their feet. I don't know if you've ever been involved in foot washing. I have a few times. Even in our day, where feet aren't dusty and all of that, it's quite a different experience to have somebody wash your feet. It's frankly, I found it easier to wash theirs than to have them wash mine. Anyway, moving on with the story. Verse 6, he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." See, Peter's leaning on his own understanding. He's like, no, wait a minute. No, you're the Lord. I'm here to serve you. So this is completely out of order. And it was out of order with everything Peter had known. He was leaning on his own mind, his own understanding, his own cultural understanding, his upbringing. So he was speaking out of his own understanding. So at least Peter was being honest and forthright. And then Jesus says this, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." In other words, hey, Peter, if I don't do this, you're not one of my guys. Peter says, "Oh," verse 9, "Then, Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." So when Peter realizes this is a deal breaker, if you don't let me wash your feet, in other words, if we don't let Jesus serve us, then we're not his. We have to learn how to receive. And he says, "Well, then wash my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "A person who's had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I've done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them." So Jesus set an example of service to one another. And he did that because he was not above any sort of a task. He knew where he came from, he knew what he was here for, and he knew where he was going. Now, one place that we can kind of feel lost is not knowing what we're here for. Let me encourage you with this. From decades down the line, I'm not an expert, but I've grown by the grace of God in some areas. Often we wonder what we're here for. Scripturally speaking, what we're here for above all is to be loved by God and to love him in return. And that really is the soil that everything else in our lives grows from. Our relationship with God is number one. And from that, if we're growing in our relationship with God, we'll be a better spouse, we'll be a better parent, we'll be a better child, we'll be a better employer or employee, we'll be a better friend, we'll be a better disciple maker, as we interact with other people. And what we will find is that invariably, as we grow in our relationship with God, he will point us to someone and say, serve them. Serve your spouse, serve your children or your parents, serve your friends, serve your grandparents, serve your neighbors. Take what God has given you and serve others with it. And Jesus, as always, is our ultimate example, the one who would soon give his life as a ransom for many and free us from the dominion of darkness. Took a towel, put it around his waist, and washed his own disciples' feet because he knew where he came from, what he was here for, which is relationship with God that flows out into relationship with others in service, and he knew where he was going. So I pray that that is the mentality and the heartbeat that you'll take into your life today and all the days from here on. God bless you, and we'll look forward to seeing you on another video. Bye-bye.